everybody to Convocations today. I just have a few announcements for those who are enrolled in the class before we get started with the introduction of our speaker today. First announcement is for cultural events, start thinking of, remember, a woman and the youngest person to receive more than one Association of Mormon Letters Drama Awards, and is only one of two playwrights to have received 4 of those awards. Her presentation today examines the process of adapting or translating Jane Austen's classic novel Persuasion into a dramatic work for the stage. The presentation will also include performances of scenes from the Theater Arts Department's current production of Persuasion. So let's give a warm welcome to Melissa Leilani Larson.
I'm not going to drop anything. I'm not going to spill anything. I'm telling you so that I'm manifesting it. I'm putting it into the world. Hello. My name is Leilani Larson. I write things. You can call me Mel. Please don't call me Missy. I am a playwright. And yes, as Professor Freeman mentioned, the title of this presentation is The Art of Translating Prose to Drama. And adaptation is typically what we call writing a novel story for the stage, transforming it into a play. I like the word translation because there are a lot of different ways that we communicate, and we often, a lot of those ways, we recognize, whether consciously or subconsciously, as language. And I feel that there are a lot of languages at play when you are sitting alone reading a book, and there are a lot of languages at play when you are sitting in an audience watching a theatrical production. So, so I think about adapting a work as translating it from one medium to another. Oh, you know what? Oh, you know what? I'm gonna, let's see. I'm gonna, let's quote up. This is a quote from Persuasion. I'm gonna grab my book real quick. This is actually a not great iPhone photo, a page from my personal copy of Persuasion. And this quote is really important to me for a lot of reasons, and it's really important to what we're talking about today. So I'd like to introduce you to it now, and then we're going to come back to it again a little later. The part that's highlighted reads, "The sweet scenes of autumn were for a while put by, unless some tender sonnet, fraught with the apt analogy of the declining year, with declining happiness, and the images of youth and hope, and spring, all gone together, blessed her memory." I just want to, there are a lot of reasons that this is really beautiful to me. I mean, the prose is beautiful. It tells you a lot about Anne, who's the protagonist in this novel and in the play. It's also very important to the creation of this play, but I will get into that a little bit later. I just wanted to introduce you to that for now, so it's familiar. So some of the differences between a play and a book, between prose and drama. When you're reading a book, you are doing it all by yourself, usually. It's a solitary experience. It's one of the things as a reader I enjoy. I like to be by myself, to find a really cozy chair and spend some time with the book. You are in charge as the reader of how you consume the story. You can read at your own pace. You could play all of the characters if you want. You have the freedom to start and stop whenever you need to. And if you love a particular page, you can go back and read it again. If you hate something and it's boring, you can skip ahead. I find myself doing that sometimes with novels. I might skip to the end. When you go to see a play, the experience is a little different. You're meant to see it with other people. It's meant to be a communal experience. It's a community event. Even sometimes you may go to a really specialized theatrical production with a very small audience. It's still intended. There is a separation between you sitting in the audience and the actors on stage, however thin that separation may be. The director of the show and the playwright of the play, also the actors and the designers, costume set, lights, they all direct how you as an audience experience that play, which is different than you reading a book by yourself. One of the difficulties of being an adapter is that sometimes folks don't like the choices that I make because they know the book and they don't love what I do, and that's fine. But that's one of the things that just is going to be different. Another thing that's different is the consumption of time. You are reading a book, as I said before, you can start and stop whenever you like. You can read it on the train on the way to work. You can listen to audiobooks while you're working out. You can be reading it surreptitiously on your iPad in the back row at church. You can be doing, you can read whenever you want, and you can take an afternoon to read a book, or you could take weeks. When you watch a play, you're coming to a certain place, you're sitting in a seat, and you are watching that story unfold over a certain amount of time. And the story is told in such a way that it fits in that window. Another thing that's different, I mentioned this before, the personalized versus the directed experience, reader imagination versus production choices. There's also the ways that information is delivered differently. It's delivered differently in a book than it is on stage. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in detail. And we also have narration and description in a book versus in a play. Most of what happens is said aloud. It's spoken by actors. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. So narration is basically, I think one of the things a lot of people might expect right out of the gate if they're coming to see a play that's based on a book is that there might be an actor in the play who's playing a narrator, who's going to speak to you through what we call in the theater the fourth wall, who's going to speak to you directly as an audience member, the way the narrator speaks to you omnisciently through a book when you're reading. Sometimes we have them in films too. In a film, it's going to be a voiceover, that mysterious voice you hear that's above and around the scene but not in the scene itself. And they do occasionally happen on stage. I have another play that I'm working on right now that is a historical drama. It's a true story. And the reason that I have a character that's a narrator is that she was an eyewitness to what happened. And historically, we know that she witnessed what happens. And so it makes sense for her to tell the audience, this is what I saw. With Persuasion, and with, I have my other Austen adaptation, Pride and Prejudice, I made a very conscious choice artistically for myself that I didn't want to have a narrator. The narration is something that's very important and integral to how the books work. And part of adapting, part of translating this book to the stage is finding a way to make the narrator's voice heard in the play without having them embodied in a narrator, if that makes sense. Usually when you are working on an adaptation, or when I'm working on an adaptation, I will ask myself, can you get away without a narrator? Is there a way you can get that information across that doesn't involve stopping the story and telling the audience, like I am now with a microphone, hey, this is what's up, this is what you need to know? Are there other ways to deliver that information? I'm going to share some examples of that with you as we go on. This is an example of narration from Persuasion. This is a particularly funny passage from a little later in the novel. So Persuasion is the story of a woman named Anne Elliot who, when she was a young woman, met and fell in love with a sailor who didn't have any money. Her family is very wealthy, his family is not. Her family did not approve of him, and they broke up. Most of the story takes place 8 years later, when Anne and Wentworth, her sailor, are brought back together again. Anne's family has moved to Bath, which is, I think, one of the best names for a city in England. One of the things I really love about England, this has nothing to do with anything, but one of the things I love about England are the names for things. Like streets have the best names, the tube stations have the best names, Elephant and Castle, and Bath is named, there's a hot spring that the Romans made into an actual bathhouse, and that's how Bath gets its name. And it's just a great name for a town, I think. So Anne's family goes to Bath because they don't have any money, and in Bath, they are in a better position to act like they have money even though they don't. And Anne's family, they're not nice people. And so this is a little bit of the narrator speaking about them. The worst of Bath was the number of its plain women. And the he in this bit of narration is Anne's father, Sir Walter. We'll say, Sir Walter did not mean to say that there were no pretty women, but the number of the plain was out of all proportion. He had frequently observed as he walked that one handsome face would be followed by 30 or 35 frights. And once, as he had stood in a shop in Bond Street, he had counted 87 women go by, one after another, without there being a tolerable face among them. And then it goes on to say, oh, but the men are even worse. So this is a very famous bit of narration. The narrator is talking about what Sir Walter is thinking. And what I do when I adapt this scene, these are the two side by side, is I change the pronouns a little. So Sir Walter is talking directly. He owns the sentiment that the narrator is assigning to him. And I even go a little further. So he says the worst of Bath in the novel, is the number of its plain women. The worst of Bath is its exorbitant number of ugly people. So adaptation in this moment is a little bit of taking what is in the novel, adjusting it so that it can be said in a different format, and then also putting a little bit of a spin on it so that it's in my voice as a writer. And it's also great fun to watch an actor say, once I stood up in a shop in Bond Street and counted 87 women go by. Alrighty. So this is an example of narration and how I adjust narration in the adaptation process. Something that is a kind of a big deal in adaptation is the trick of exposition. Exposition is something, it's basically the backstory when you are introducing characters in a story. And that doesn't mean that is the same across any medium. It's in plays, in screenplays, in novels, epic poetry. Anywhere where you're telling a story, exposition is always there. It's always necessary. The thing about exposition, the trick, is that it requires balance. And these are questions that I ask myself when I'm writing a scene, which is, does the audience need to know this? And does the audience need to know this now? And if the answer to either of those questions is no, then it doesn't go in the scene. How can you deliver exposition as organically as possible? So we want things to be really natural. Some of you may be familiar with a German theater guy, a theater maker, Bertolt Brecht, who's very, very into letting people know that he is putting on a show, to the point where he would probably put up a sign and say, now it's time for the exposition. However, most of the time, exposition should never stop the story from moving forward. Sharing exposition, it must be motivated by the moment. There's a really famous Broadway show, it's kind of a cult classic now. It's, again, really great title. It's called Urinetown. And Urinetown starts with a song that is literally called Too Much Exposition, where the joke of the song is that the show's writers are telling you straight up, these are all the things you need to know before we start the show. And they write into a song and they know that it's all an expository dump, but they're very upfront about that. And the fact that they own it makes the song really funny. Exposition is one of those things that I personally really love when it's kind of sprinkled throughout a story and not all at the beginning. I like to think about it as gravy. Just the right amount of gravy makes your mashed potatoes so great. Too much gravy ruins your plate. So it's something that it's really great, it's necessary, but too much of it gets in the way of what you're trying to do. This is a little example from the novel of exposition, where Anne is upset because her sister and her sisters-in-law can't stop talking about Captain Wentworth. And to hear them talking about him so much, repeating his name so often, puzzling over past years, and at last ascertaining that it probably would turn out to be the very same man that she had known 8 years before. It's a trial to her nerves. This section, this is just one small paragraph in the novel. This is something that I'm able to use throughout the play. This informs a lot of conversations. It informs a lot of character choices. It informs a lot of what's happening throughout the story, even though it's just one tiny little paragraph. Let's see. This little tiny paragraph also gives us a lot of important information. It tells us that Captain Wentworth is coming to town. It tells us that Anne's family can't stop talking about him. It tells us that they vaguely remember meeting him, but that they don't necessarily remember that she has a connection to him. It tells us that her family is unaware that they can be harmful and hurtful to her, either because they are oblivious or because she doesn't tell them, or probably, I think, a little bit of both. It also tells us that Anne has to get used to being with this person that she can't stop thinking about. All of that information is packed into this tiny little paragraph, and I kind of try to dispense it throughout the play. Theatricality. What is theatricality? I think I've probably used the word theatrical or theatrically a couple of times so far. Theatrical is a word that we use to reference, I like to think of it as referencing things that can happen in the theater that can't happen anywhere else. The Cambridge English Dictionary says that it's the quality of belonging to or relating to the theater. That's the second definition. The first definition says someone who's being dramatic, overly dramatic in a real-life conversation, which I just think is. But I think that it's the moments in a play that work on stage that don't work in any other storytelling media. And what I've tried to do with this play is find ways to tell this story that make this experience singular to the theater, and then also are still true to the themes in the story that are in the novel. And if we think about these three things that I've touched on so far, exposition, narration, and theatricality, I'm going to go to this next. This is a moment, I'm not going to read all of this to you if you want to have a look at that, but this is a moment in the show where we have what is a little bit of a fantasy scene where Anne imagines herself as a younger person and imagines when she and Wentworth were still together. And this is meant to be, it's a suggestion of how she might be feeling. It's a quite beautiful moment in the play. It's because there's music and there's dancing, there's a lot that's happening. That's not something that you can do in a book. It wouldn't necessarily make sense. If you read this in a novel, she kind of has a little bit of a fantasy moment where she remembers what her time with Wentworth was like, and it looks and feels like a dance. That doesn't work in a novel. You could make it work in a film, but it's not something you see typically in film. On stage, we can have this moment happen. And one of the things I try to do with this play is we actually have these moments that are created, that I have written, that are inspired by the novel and the story, but don't necessarily take place in the present time. They take place 8 years before. These, it's another example of theatricality. I'm going to show you a couple of other clips from the story, and then I'm going to introduce a scene from the play that I think will demonstrate this to you very well. I'm very lucky to have some of the actors from the cast here to demonstrate this for you. This is from fairly early in the book. Chapter 4, if any of you are familiar with the story, is where a lot of the backstory for the romance that I tell in these memory scenes, that's where it all comes from. So in this moment, Lady Russell is kind of a mother figure in Anne's life, and basically she persuades Anne, which is where the title of the novel comes from, to end her relationship with Wentworth. And that's what it says right here in the middle. She was persuaded to believe the engagement a wrong thing, indiscreet, improper, hardly capable of success, and not deserving it. This is another moment. This is from a little later on. In such moments, Anne had no power of saying to herself, "These rooms ought to only belong to us." This was something that in reading the novel struck me. And with these memory scenes, as a playwright in the space of the theater, I can have Anne talk to herself about these things. That's not something that you can do in any other medium, not really. And then I want to go back to this quote that I shared with you at the beginning. In the middle of the quote, "And the images of youth and hope and spring all gone together blessed her memory." So this quote is important to me in the writing of this play because this is basically was the impetus for this idea of having these memory scenes in the play that are hinted at in the novel but don't exist in the novel. So what I do in the story is that I actually require an Anne and Frederick in the present day and an Anne and Frederick in the past. And the play starts with a scene between young Anne and young Frederick, so 8 years in the past, and its memory, you experience it along with Anne, who is having that memory. And I'm going to let the actors come out and show that to you now. is Shayla Florence, Landon Bullock, and Chloe Hannah. Excellent. Okay, really quickly, because I think we're going to get short on time. I wanted to show you another scene, and that will probably be the thing that we conclude on before we stop for questions. Is that right? And so there's a lot happening in the scene. This is the very first scene you're going to see when you come to the show tonight. You'll be so prepared. And we learn a lot about who these people are. We set up a lot of the information that Jane tells us about the backstory of the show. We tell it as if it's in the present, as if it's happening right now. We introduce you to these characters when they're younger, so that we can associate them with their present selves. And this idea, the images of youth and hope and spring all gone together, blessed her memory. This is my attempt to put that idea on stage. These images of youth, Anne's younger self, on stage at the same time as Anne's current self. The next scene that I want to show you really quickly is a scene a little bit later on. And we meet Captain Wentworth in the present day, and we see his first memory of Anne, which is of a different moment in this relationship's arc. And so let's go ahead and have that. Actors, come on out. Sorry. That's a go. That's a G-O. that great? You should come and see the show. It's really great. Let's see. So that was Chloe, Shayla, and Landon again, and they were joined by Ruby Bagley, McKenna Stevens, Lainey Bentley, Jackson Brown, and Joshua Peterson. Thanks very much. Come and see the show. They're wonderful. So I wanted to show you those scenes so you could compare and contrast the way those memories are in the show that we have. You are looking at what Anne is choosing to remember and what Wentworth is choosing to remember, and that those are very starkly contrasted. And then there are a number of memories in the play that are triggered by moments in the story. And so these are my way of making clear on stage what these characters are feeling and thinking, in addition to what is happening just in the story that is very, very truthful to the action of the novel. Which is why I wanted to have that scene with Anne's sister, Mary, her husband Charles, and his sisters Henriette and Louisa, and how they're all kind of buzzing around Wentworth. And remember that clip that I showed you earlier, that excerpt that talks about how they can't stop talking about Wentworth, and Anne is just, it's hurtful to her. So that was, but that scene, the way that they're talking about him and at him and around him is what kind of triggers his memory of his last interaction with Anne, which was that conversation. We are just about out of time, so if anybody has any questions, and I understand if anyone needs to leave at 1:20 because that's when the class is over, that's fine, but I'm also available to stay a few minutes afterward for questions. So thanks very much. Questions? Comments?
Oh, sorry. When you're called on, make sure you wait for the microphone so the live stream can actually hear you. I think we probably have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions, but then afterwards, if you want to come and talk to Mel, that would be great as well.
So the language is obviously very different than we use today and such. What is your way of both understanding and then recreating the language in the way that it is?
Oh, that's great. So I sometimes think that maybe I was born in the wrong time. I have just been exposed to a lot of novels and documents from this time period. I really love letters and letter writing, and letters are actually a big part of the show as well as a theatrical device. So it's something, the language is something that I kind of automatically go to. It's what I'm, is I look at the way that Jane constructs her sentences, and then I want to try to, my goal is to write the lines in the play that are not in the book in such a way that you can't tell the difference between the two. So my goal is to try to pass my own stuff off as Jane Austen. And so what I try to do is I study a lot of her work. I study, and some of the words have to change because we use them differently than Jane Austen used them in her day. Some of the vocabulary is different. And so I usually think about the emotions in the scene in a very contemporary way. This is a conversation. These are 2 young people who are breaking up. They're ending their relationship. And I have to think, though, about how that would be said in this time period in 1806. So I usually do a lot of personal research. I read a lot of pieces that feel like the right time period and try to make my work sound like that. That answered the question. Any other question? Something that's going to wake you up at 3 o'clock in the morning because you're so bothered that you didn't ask it.
Yeah, I guess my big question is when you're working on your translations or adaptations, how you consider theatrical technical elements and when they fold into your creating space and lighting movement, but still leaving room for designers and technicians and stuff as you're working through these pieces.
Sure, that's a great question. So something, I actually, for a little while, I went to graduate school. I finished my undergrad, and like the very end of undergrad, realized I was a playwright, which is not what I studied in undergrad at all. And so I kind of had to change track when I went to graduate school. And part of that was becoming a stage manager, which is basically the person who calls the show whenever says lights go, actors go, everything goes. And being a stage manager actually helped me to really understand how the tech of the theater works. And so as a playwright, I actually think about that a lot. And something with adaptation that one of the things that is intimidating is it's a novel. It's a lot of story. It takes place over months and months. And it takes place in a lot of locations. It takes place at a seawall at the ocean. There are a lot of things. There's also a scene in an inn. There's a grave injury. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the show. And what I try to think of is how we can, the story is always the most important thing. We always want to tell the story as clearly as possible. So I think about the way, I think the tech should support that and be visible, but also invisible, if that makes sense. You notice it afterward. You notice how stunning the set and the costumes were, but you notice that because the scene transported you somewhere else, and not because in the middle of the scene, nothing was happening. Does that make sense? So I feel like they all kind of go together, and because there are a lot of scenes and there are a lot of locations, I try to just let the story move. It flows. A lot of my work is very, very fluid. A character will move from one side of the stage to the other, and we are in another place. Sometimes a character will move from one side to the other, and they are in another time. Because we set up the rules for the audience. This is what's going to happen when you see this play, and we follow those rules, and folks understand what's happening. So I think that it's very important. I don't want to tell the designers what to do. I want them to have room to play and to try things, but I also, it's very important to tell the story in a whole way, theatrically.
Well, I think it's about 1:20 right now, so if you do have a class, feel free to leave. But I want to plug before anybody does go, right? Please do come see the whole play, and if you have more questions for Mel afterwards, she's going to be here. And let's give a last round of applause.